Friesen as
This meeting is being recorded.
speaker. Rachel is a first-year master's student at Cal Poly. And she grew up in California. She's a California girl. She grew up in the foothills outside of Yosemite, looking at plants from a very young age. She did her undergrad at UC Davis. And then since her undergrad, she's worked as a field biologist for the BLM, American Rivers, and then NPS, the National Park Service in Yosemite and Sequoia Kings Canyon National Park, doing a bunch of different types of ecological monitoring and restoration. And she's also a wonderful chef and a baker, if you've been fortunate enough to get her to make you something. And most of all, she's really just inspired this team of undergrads to really take a leading role in her project. And 3 of them are here tonight and are actually going to co-present. And so that's Olivia Ross, who's a recent graduate. She's now up in Santa Cruz, putting her sort of degree to use. Ruby Sybil, and then Brooke Wallish. And with that, I'll just let you take over, Rachel, and take it away.
Great. Thanks so much, Dina. And thank you all for being here. This means so much that we have such a big turnout. I'm going to go ahead and share my screen. So give me a second. And okay. So we're going to be talking tonight about alpine plants in Yosemite, and Dina already did a great job introducing us. So let's just get going. So where are we going to go tonight? Or what's the roadmap, or shall I say the trail map for our talk? So first, we're going to define what we mean when we say alpine. And then we're going to talk about the importance of alpine plants as both a model study system and their role in the larger ecosystem. Then we're going to explore the wild world of alpine plant adaptations and all the special adaptations that allow these little plants to survive in incredibly harsh alpine environments. After that, we're going to talk about climate change and predictions about what is going to happen to alpine plants. And finally, we're going to discuss our research project, what we're actually doing. Okay, so to start off with, Brooke is going to talk about what is the alpine.
All right, so of course we want to make sure everybody was on the same page with what exactly defines the alpine. So the alpine is actually the area that's above tree line, but then of course you have to define tree line. And believe it or not, tree line is actually thermally defined. It's not defined by elevation, which many people think. And it's actually not likely to be strictly defined by latitude either, mostly because slope, aspect, and other factors can actually impact that thermal environment. And it's also not defined by the highest limit a tree can grow, which seems kind of counterintuitive considering it is tree line. And I'll talk about why that is in just a second. But officially, tree line is thermally defined. It's a thermally defined ecotone. Ecotone is just kind of that region between the subalpine and alpine, or really any 2 types of ecosystems, where the mean growing season temperature is approximately 6.4 degrees Celsius. So above tree line, trees actually can exist, which is interesting. They just won't be in true tree form. So instead, they'll be kind of gnarled, low-growing shrub-like trees. And you call that Krummholz, fun German word. The direct translation is crooked wood. So they're kind of these weird crooked trees. And a lot of times they'd be right smack in the middle of our transect. So you'd be trying to read the transect line, and then there would just be this wall of this kind of tree-like thing. It would just be these tiny little, like this trunks would be like that big. And it was so hard to tell which individual is which because it was just so many stems. So if you ever have the opportunity when you're at Alpine, make sure you try to crawl through a Krummholz tree. It is quite the experience. All right, I think we're ready for the next slide. All right, so in California specifically, tree line, all right, I guess we never went to the next slide.
Okay.
Well, this was a slide for the previous information, but so in California, tree line is actually between 2,700 and 3,500 meters. So the alpine is kind of that little grayish region on the map there. And our study system specifically was in Yosemite National Park, which is kind of right in the middle of that gray section there. And the subset of plots that we chose out of the mini plots that they surveyed 30 years ago were generally above 2,900 meters or 9,500 feet. And yeah, it's pretty much all I got for that. There are a lot of different alpine regions in California and nearby. But yeah, now Rachel is going to talk to you about glaciers, which will be very interesting.
Cool. Thanks, Brooke. So now zooming into the central Sierra Nevada to Yosemite National Park. So picture Yosemite. Most people think of vertical cliffs and polished domes, deep canyons that were carved out by glaciers. But along the crest of the Sierra, the highest alpine habitat was unglaciated even during the glacial maxima periods around 20,000 years ago. So here, this is a view of the Dana Plateau, and behind there is Mono Lake, just on the tippy top crest of the Sierra. And then here's some great visuals kind of to help you picture how this glaciation actually happened. Look at this. This map is incredible. This is a recently completed map of the last glacial maximum. So when there's just a ton of ice sheets all over North America, including in the Sierra. To orient you, here's Yosemite Valley down here, and then Tioga Pass is over here. So there's just this sea of ice covering Yosemite, and some parts it was over half a mile deep. But if you look just along the crest here, you can see the highest mountains on this east side were peeking out almost like islands surrounded by the sea of ice. And so glaciers never covered them. And same with this graphic. This massive ice kind of slowly carving away the surface around these high peaks. And this is another view. So here's an unglaciated plateau, and then the glaciated kind of polished landscape below. And these unglaciated plateaus are defined by having these really vertical, steep sides, like you can see here. And so you may wonder, why exactly didn't glaciers form on top of these surfaces? A lot of them are, like I said, on the eastern edge of the Sierra. And so you're picturing storms coming from the Pacific, and they're dropping their moisture as they go over the mountains. And by the time they reach the crest, the storms are they've dropped a lot of their moisture. And so they're just not as much snow falls on the eastern side. And then also these sites, they're flat and super windy. So any snow that falls tends to just blow away. And so glaciers, which are just basically a ton of snow that solidifies into ice and then moves, these glaciers were unable to form on these surfaces. And even though they carved out the surrounding areas. Here's another view. This is from Kuna Crest, a region we got to visit this past summer. And you can see just the vertical steep walls looking over the edge, and then you see this polished granite below and these beautiful lake basins. And now, so picture you're standing on the edge of the cliff, and from the same photo point, you just turn around, and this is what the landscape behind you looks like on top of the unglaciated plateau. And it's this kind of strange landscape, almost from another planet, of this boulder field the boulders are kind of evenly spaced apart. And this is kind of a common scene that you'll see on a lot of these unglaciated landforms. And so you're driving or walking through Yosemite, and you look up at the highest peaks in the park, and from a distance, they just look like a pile of rocks. And you may wonder, is there really any soil up there? And then, y'all are plant people, so can plants really grow up there? So it turns out there's actually quite a bit of soil on these unglaciated plateaus. Here on the edge of the Dana Plateau, you can see the soil layer on top of the mountain here. And this is 20 feet of soil. So there is soil. And you may wonder, how did that soil form? And it's through this process called cryoturbation. So here's your big word of the evening, if you don't walk away with anything else. So the cryoturbation is this process of repeated freezing and thawing of the ground over centuries that kind of churns the whole ground, rocks and soil, and the gradual the freezing and expanding of the soil breaks the rocks down into smaller and smaller pieces until you're ultimately left with soil. This is a view of Mount Lewis, and you can see the soil almost like pouring off the top of the mountain, kind of like frosting on a cupcake. Scientists estimate that these soils are incredibly old. They're said to be eroding at a rate of about 1 to 2 feet per million years. So think about that next time maybe you go off trail and walk around on these soils. So far, we've seen pictures of a lot of different mountains in Yosemite. And one thing you might have noticed already is that these mountains are different colors. And with that, you probably think they're made up of different types of rocks, and you'd be right. So for example, like here's Mount Conness here, and it's kind of this tan gray granite. And then whereas Kuna the rocks are this dark gray metavolcanic rocks. And so some people have hypothesized that maybe the different nutrients in these different types of rocks could be driving community assemblage of plants. But Elizabeth Wenck did her thesis on this, and she found out, which is really fascinating, that it's not the difference in the nutrient content, but it's just the difference in the soil structure and water holding capacity of the soil that drives different plant community assemblages. So it kind of comes down to basic physics. Like if you're growing as a plant in darker soils, you'll be a couple degrees warmer than if you're growing on a lighter colored surface. So that's pretty fascinating. So this is sort of our segue. I know everyone's here for the plants and for the pretty photos, and maybe not as much for the geology, but the geology is important. So with that, I'm going to turn it back over to Brooke to talk about why alpine plants are important.
All right, I'm going to remember to switch the slides this time from this slide.
No, it's okay.
Let's start with that. Let's switch the slide.
The next one? Great.
Yeah. All right, so why are alpine plants important? So as you can imagine, in the alpine, there are still animals up there. You got your pikas, your marmots, your bighorn sheep. And of course, they have to eat something. So the kind of most logical importance of plants is just as a food source for many of these alpine animals. One really cool example is Holzia algida, which is our alpine gold on the lower left there. It's actually a favorite snack of the endangered Sierra Nevada population of bighorn sheep. We missed them by a couple minutes this summer. We were so determined to see them and just missed them. But if you have had the opportunity to see them or pictures of them, you know they're absolutely amazing, majestic animals, and they deserve to have all their favorite snacks. So for that reason, we think we should definitely keep these plants around. But of course, there's many other reasons as well. But yeah, they're really important just for kind of a foundational food source for a lot of animals up there. And also certain plants can also be nursery plants. And a lot of those nursery plants are cushion plants, which just means they kind of form this pincushion shape. We'll kind of go into detail on that later. You can kind of see it a little bit in the Sierra Nevada pedestra in the upper right-hand corner there. But basically by having that shape and being this kind of dense mound, they create their own microclimate a lot of times. So they kind of control where the wind goes, or kind of like an airplane wing. And for that reason, they kind of can protect other plants. So with Pedestra specifically, I noticed while we were up there, you'd always find little like graminoids, little grasses, just like poking up through the middle of them. And a lot of other cushion plants too, we would see that. And they're actually facilitating the growth of these other plant species. And that's really important because if you think about it, if you lose those cushion plants and lose those nursery plants, then you're also potentially going to lose the plants that are relying on them to be able to exist because they need that shelter. So it just kind of shows how interconnected all of these different plants are, especially in such a harsh environment. And so it's not only that alpine plants are important, but specific alpine plants are even more important in order to ensure that we can keep the biodiversity that's up there currently. And now kind of moving into more why alpine plants are important to us and to climate change and to the research that we're doing here. Alpine plants are actually experiencing, or the temperature is changing faster in the alpine than it is in lowland areas. So that creates this cool study system where alpine plants can actually be sensitive indicators for climate change. They're kind of living at this climate extreme. A lot of them are very specialized. And for that reason, they've kind of become this bellwether for ecological effects of climate change. There's been a lot of studies, especially in the Alps over in Europe. Not as many over here in North America, but that's why we're doing this study. And essentially, alpine regions are also just spread across the globe. So we're studying global climate change, right? It's nice to have a study system where there's these kind of small pockets of alpine area that's just kind of spread around the globe. And it's just created this really awesome study system that a lot of people are starting to study, and we are very happy to be contributing to that. And then the last point for importance is California is considered a biodiversity hotspot, which I'm sure many of you know as part of the California Native Plant Society. But that just means that there's a ton of biodiversity here and a ton of endemics, which means a lot of the species can only exist wherever they are. For example, that same pedestra on the upper right-hand corner is actually endemic to Yosemite. And that just means that if we lose that, that can mean it's a lot more important than some of the other species that are more common. Like those plants can only exist there. So once we lose them, we've lost them forever, which is really unfortunate. So it's just something to keep in mind. And they can also, if they're specialized, they can have a harder time handling the changes that we're seeing with climate change as well. And although at a glance, it can seem like alpine diversity is kind of limited, as you can see from that image kind of right next to the title there, and really from any of these, there's just so much diversity here. But especially in a small area, like when you're walking around in those boulder fields and you kind of look down like where you're stepping in the little pockets of soil in between, you kind of kneel down and look and realize there's so many species that you're stepping on, which is unfortunate, but there's just so many species in such a small area. And for that reason, like they're all relying on each other just to survive in these little pockets. And beyond just their beauty and intrinsic value, like maintaining the biodiversity is important for ensuring the health of those biological communities, and also just maintaining functional and stable ecosystems in the Alpine. Yeah. And then next, I wanted to move on to community interactions. So this is kind of connected to what I was talking about at the beginning with those nursery plants and also with the food source. But alpine plants are really important components of alpine ecosystems, and a lot of different organisms rely on them. So of course, they're foundations of many food webs, as you can see from this very, very cute little marmot, kind of the second picture from the right there. That was up by Mount Dana, and he was just one fist at a time, just eating a ton of lupin. He was having a grand old time. Super fun taking that photo. But beyond just being a food source, you also have those kind of pollinator interactions, as you can see from that little butterfly sitting on that coyote mint there. But pollination is really kind of key because you have this insect or bird or whatever the pollinator is that's relying on that plant for a food source, but then that plant is then relying on that animal or insect or whatever for pollination to be able to reproduce and continue existing, really. And that kind of connection between them can unfortunately break down in the face of climate change a lot of times due to what's called changes in phenology. So phenology is really just the timing of different important events in a plant's life or really any animal's life as well. And let's just say hypothetical situation that unfortunately is not so hypothetical. Maybe alpine temperatures are increasing. And if that happens, then the snow melt may occur earlier than normal. And then that could cause the flowers to go into flower a little earlier than they normally would. And if that occurs, you can have different things happening. For example, maybe the pollinator hasn't migrated back yet, or it's just not able to exist when it's that cold. Or maybe the marmot is still hibernating. And if that happens, you can have different mismatches between those interactions. And so if the peak time for the most amount of lupin is not the time that the marmot has made it out of its hibernation, then that can be really detrimental for both the animal and the plant and just any of those interactions. It's really important that they stay matched up. So just something to keep in mind that is an effect of climate change that we're expecting to see. There's been some research that's started on that already. But yeah, it just kind of goes to show how important these alpine plants are to the ecosystems that they're part of and these interactions that they have with other animals in those ecosystems. Now I'm turning it over to, I'm not actually sure who.
Yeah, over to Ruby next. Thanks, Bert.
Okay, so I'm going to talk about some cool strategies for survival that we see in these alpine plants. And as many of you know who've been up in the Alpine, and if you haven't, you can kind of imagine this with us, but the Alpine is a really harsh environment, with all these kind of unique challenges, including there's really harsh winters up in the Alpine. These plants are covered in snow for the majority of the months out of the year. And when the snow finally melts in the spring, these plants only have a few months to grow and reproduce before it starts snowing again in the fall. So there's a really short growing season that these plants have to be well adapted to. The Alpine is also a really windswept terrain. So there aren't, as we learned from Brooke, there aren't any trees, at least growing in tree form up in the Alpine. And so there's nothing to really block the wind. And these plants are often growing on these really exposed faces of these beautiful mountains, but they have to be really well adapted to the wind. And there's also really high levels of UV radiation. So up in these high elevation areas, there's thinner atmosphere, there's just more UV bombarding these plants. And if they don't have a way to adapt to this, there can be DNA mutations and problems with the cells. So they have to be really well adapted to all these challenges. So one of the first strategies for survival that I'll talk about that Brooke kind of touched on already is to grow in a cushion shape. And so as Brooke mentioned, as opposed to a plant that's kind of more like sprawling around in the environment, these cushion plants are this really dense kind of like mound of all of the parts of the plant growing kind of like a little pin cushion. And you can kind of see that on the picture on the right. All the leaves are really smushed closely together. And what's cool about this is you can kind of see this on the left picture, but over time there can be soil that will accumulate and create kind of this more little mound shape where the wind is kind of flowing over the top of the plant and creating this little microhabitat of this windless environment in the inner parts of the plant. And so in this really harsh, windy environment, these plants are actually creating their own little microhabitats that are really well suited for being more warm and being less windy. And not only does this benefit the plant, but as Brooke mentioned, a lot of cushion plants are what we call nursery plants, and they allow many other little plants to grow in this little microhabitat. So that's really cool. Another strategy for survival is to grow slowly and live a long time. As I mentioned, there are really short growing seasons up in the Alpine, so plants just don't really have time to grow a lot and reproduce all in one growing season. The plant that's pictured is a little Ivesea seedling, and it's only 1 centimeter tall, but we actually estimate that it's around 2 or 3 years old. So that really shows just how slowly these plants are growing up there. And something that I kind of like to think about up in the Alpine is that when you're walking around, you're seeing these like 3-inch, 4-inch, 5-inch tall plants. But in some cases, especially the old ones, they can be decades or even hundreds of years old. So it's kind of like you're walking through like a little miniature old growth forest, which I think is cool. Another strategy for survival is to be succulent and have a taproot. So as I mentioned, the Alpine environment is super windy. So the moisture in the air is constantly being blown away. And because it's so cold, there's just not a lot of moisture in the air to begin with. And so these plants have to get their water somehow. So a lot of plants will have really deep taproots. Plants like this in the picture can have taproots of up to 6 feet deep. So they're able to kind of like dig around in the soil and get that water that other plants wouldn't be able to reach. And the succulent leaves, as you can see in the picture also, they help the plant maintain moisture and prevent evaporation. So there's less surface area for evaporation. And also the waxy layer that's often found on these succulent leaves helps prevent evaporation as well. Another cool adaptation or strategy for survival is to be red. So notice the really red pigmentation on these cute little monkey flowers. This is from a pigment called anthocyanin. And it almost serves as a sunscreen to help prevent UV damage. So this pigment is kind of preventing and diffusing away UV rays that would otherwise be really harmful to the plant. Another strategy is to cover yourself in hair, which is kind of similar to the red adaptation, but the hairs can also help diffuse this really intense UV light that's coming in. And these thick little hairs can also help prevent evaporation. And the last adaptation that I'll talk about is to have narrow leaves. I think this one is kind of cool because it combats multiple of these challenges. But narrow leaves first won't get torn by wind as easily as thicker leaves. You can imagine, or not thicker, but wider leaves. You can imagine like a really big leaf being kind of like torn by the wind, but these, sorry, my cat is yelling in the background. The thinner leaves are more aerodynamic and won't get torn by wind as easily. And we also see a waxy layer that's pretty common on these thinner leaves that will, again, help that water evaporation.
Great, thanks so much, Ruby. So next we're going to talk about climate change. Let's see.
All right, I could talk on the slide if you'd like.
Oh, and yeah, Brooke is going to talk about this. Thanks, Brooke.
No worries. So alpine regions are experiencing temperature change associated with climate change at a faster rate, as we kind of touched on earlier. And for that reason, of course, they're bellwethers of climate change. But this graph here is from a weather station in Sequoia National Park. It's around 9,200 feet. And as you can see, over just the past 30 years, we have seen an increase in about 2 degrees Celsius. And that may not seem like a lot, but for these plants that are kind of in these tiny little niches, a lot of times they're specialized. As those populations are trying to kind of shift and potentially track these temperature changes, it can be really difficult for them to find a new place to live, essentially. So it's just something to keep in mind that 2 degrees can be a lot more detrimental than it seems. And alpine plants are thought to serve as useful indicators for climate change, since again, they are at climate extremes and tend to be specialized. But yeah, I think Rachel has a cool photo recreation coming up. I don't know if you want to talk about this, but I can try as well.
Yeah, I'll go for it. So yeah, it's one thing to see a line kind of increasing on a graph, but it's another thing to see it in person kind of visually. So here on the right is a photo that we took this last summer. And then on the left is the historic photo from the early 90s, or not historic, but 30-year-old photo. And these are of Banner and Ritter, the mountains over Mammoth Lakes. And you can see, if you look closely, just a lot of these glaciers and permanent ice fields have dramatically receded just over 3 decades. And some of them, I think this one in particular is like nearly gone. So this is kind of, when I think of the effects of climate change in the Sierra, it's this reminder of that it is already happening. We are in the midst of the climate changing. And then is this me as well, Brooke? I think, okay, cool. I'm happy to take it away. Yeah. So, and then looking into the future, scientists use models to predict what the future might look like. And so the predictions kind of say that subalpine plant communities, as you would expect, would be trying to track their climate, and they'll likely be moving upslope into alpine areas. And so there's expectation that you'll have colonization by warmer adapted plant species. And then with that, there's also an expectation that there'll be a decline in alpine specialist species, so just the species that grow on the very tops of the mountains, that they have nowhere else to go. And some models are pretty drastic. There's some predictions that up to 90% of alpine habitat will disappear in California by the end of the century. And so that's what the models say. And so this leads into our research project of what has actually happened on the ground, and what kind of data can we collect to fine-tune some of these models. And so I'll turn it over to Olivia to talk about what we actually did.
All right. Yeah, we're going to now talk about kind of the research questions we had in mind as we headed up into the Sierra last summer, and talk about how we were able to assess these alpine communities. So big picture thinking, how is climate change affecting alpine plants in Yosemite? And this question is pretty broad. So we have a few sub questions to go along with it. One being, how has species richness in the alpine changed over the last 30 years? How does the glacial history of a site impact the extent of species turnover? And lastly, are generalist plants being affected differently by climate change than alpine specialists? So as you can see on the left-hand side, this is the mountain jewel flower, scientific name Streptanthus tortuosus, and this species has a big range of where it can live. And this is unlike the Sierra pedistra on the right side, Pedistra nevadensis, and that's more of a cushion plant, as Ruby and Brooke mentioned beforehand, and this plant lives at a really tiny range, and so it's considered more of an alpine specialist. So what do we do this summer? We headed up into the Sierra and we surveyed these alpine plots that were actually established by the National Park Service 30 years ago. So in the 90s, scientists set out to create some sort of vegetation map for the park. And so that's why they established these plots. And last summer, we surveyed a subset of these plots, anything over 9,500 feet of elevation is where we were able to look at the alpine plant communities. And so we had their data, and we were able to, in the future, kind of compare what we collected and also what they saw. And on the right-hand side, you can see, of the last side, you can see the awesome 90s fashion. So we had their old photos, and it was really fun to compare and just see who surveyed these plots 30 years ago. So the first step was defining these plots. And so we had these photos from the 90s. As you can see, we recreated this one. So Ruby's on the right-hand side, fanny pack and all, and compared to the left-hand side was taken in the 90s. So this was really cool for us to see kind of what has changed. And as Rachel pointed out, the glaciers, but also the Krummholz trees have changed over time too. So we had photos for most of the plots, and then we also had GPS coordinates for a majority of the plots as well. And so once we were close to the point, we pulled out the photos, and so we were able to locate where the center of the plot was based on the photos. And we were looking for a tiny rebar in the ground, and sometimes the rebar was kind of bent over, sometimes there was no rebar, and so it was really fun to kind of go plot hunting and see if we could find them all. So upon arrival, the rebar was the center of our plot, and we laid out our survey circle by walking transect lines to the north and to the east. And our first survey that we did was all about herbs, and so we're trying to figure out who's here and how much. And so as you can see by the boxes in the circle, we laid out quadrats, and there were 1 meter by 1 meter. And on the left-hand side, there's an ocular view, and we really looked at the percentage of each species that was there. And as Brooke and Ruby mentioned, they have these nurture plants. So that draba in the center is a teeny tiny plant. And a lot of the times we'd have to look super close because one plant was actually 5 different species. And so we got to look at some plants under the hand lens, like the phlox on the right-hand side. We also had a lot of a few of the same genus. So it was cool to be able to identify the species with the hand lens when the plants were so tiny. The next survey we did was all about shrubs. So we used the transects that we laid out and determined how much shrub cover there was and what kind of shrub it was. So on the left-hand side, Ruby's looking at the shrub line and reading numbers to me, and I'm recording. And at this point, we were on top of the Dana Gibbs saddle, which was a really special place to be and survey. And as you can see in the Ridgeron, we're kind of looking at what shrubs the line crosses and recording that data too. The next portion of our survey was all about trees. And as you can see on the left-hand side, we fell in love with the Western white pine. We gave this tree lots of hugs over the course of the summer. And we measured the diameter at breast height of all the trees in the survey area, and then we also assigned them a height class. And the center picture is a ruby and a huge Krummholz, like Brooke was saying earlier, and a lot of the times you couldn't really tell where the tree was stemming from, so it was always a fun puzzle trying to figure out where the Krummholz originated. And our final survey we did was compiling an additional species list. So as you can tell, the quadrats and the transects don't cover the whole area that we survey, that entire circle. And so we walked the entire circle at the end of the survey and recorded every single species that was in that area. And if we weren't sure about the ID, we use the Flora of Yosemite by Dean Taylor. That's what Ruby and I are using in the left photo. I'm looking at an ID and I think laughing, and, Ruby is looking at the Taylor. And some of the species we weren't able to ID on site, we were able to press and take back to the lab with us to ID later on. And now I'm going to pass it back to Rachel.
Great, thanks so much, Olivia. And so we're just one field season into collecting our data. So unfortunately, we don't have results yet to share. We're processing our data and still IDing some of the specimens. But we do have results from a similar survey that was done in Sequoia Kings Canyon. Another grad student of Dina's, her name is Dina Powell-Lilly, did this research. And we're excited because they use the same methods that we are using, so we'll be able to look at all of our data together eventually. And so I just wanted to give you a taste of what we're finding out from, or what they are finding out from the Sequoia Kings data. So basically they're finding that the species are already migrating uphill to temperatures that they're used to. So the subalpine species, as predicted, are coming up into the alpine. But some good news is at this time, we're not really seeing extinctions of alpine species. And so there's some sort of lags at play. The alpine specialist species are not going extinct yet, as the model, the kind of the scary models predicted. So we'll keep you posted as we crunch the numbers and analyze our data, though. Okay, and so with that, I wanted to do a land acknowledgement. It's so important that as scientists, we both acknowledge and learn from and offer ways to give back to Indigenous communities in the places where we do our research. So in this picture, as botanists, your eyes may be drawn to this Holsia here, or alpine gold covered in beetles, but notice the piece of obsidian, this worked obsidian here. Even in some of our highest plots we sampled, we would frequently find obsidian flakes. And these serve as important reminders that this land was never empty. The national park and wilderness areas were created through the violent forced removal of people from the land. And the boundaries were drawn, the Yosemite boundaries were drawn over the ancestral homelands of many Indigenous peoples, including these 7 tribes that I've listed. And the living descendants continue to care for their ancestral lands and communities despite the ongoing impacts of colonization. And it's important also to move beyond land acknowledgement. And land acknowledgement is kind of a first step. And so I wanted to offer 2 ways you can take next steps potentially. When we enter national parks, you have to pay an entrance fee, right? So next time you go to a national park, consider giving an additional gift to local Indigenous organizations as a tangible way of acknowledgement. And here are just 2 examples for the Yosemite region. So the first one, the Southern Sierra Miwok Nation are fighting to get federal recognition. This is super important in terms of getting funding for healthcare and education, as well as just basic access to gather plants and have ceremonies on public lands like in Yosemite. And so they're asking the general public to sign a petition, write letters of support to Congress people and the Bureau of Indian Affairs, and they have a deadline coming up in May. So that's one way, even from afar. So many people love Yosemite, so I'm just trying to raise this, kind of elevate this through this talk. And then a second way is the Owens Valley Indian Water Commission, which this organization includes the Bishop Paiute tribe, one of the tribes on the previous slide, and they're raising money to buy back a 5-acre oasis near Bishop. So consider donating to that. And I'd encourage you to take actions such as these out of gratitude for their continued presence and support for sovereignty and efforts to build thriving communities. And then more acknowledgements, a special thanks to Dr. Dina Grossenbacher. She's the best advisor ever. And then as well as folks from Yosemite and the National Park Service. And thank you to all my funders, and a special shout out to the California Native Plant Society. I really appreciate all the advocacy, education, and support for research that this organization does. So thank you all for being members and participants in the society. And last shout out to Brooke. I hope you all enjoyed the awesome photos in here. I think there's only a handful of photos in this presentation that Brooke didn't take. So she has quite an eye. So yeah, it was really a gift to have her along on the journey to document the flowers and the places and the people this summer. So thank you all. And yeah, we'll stick around for questions if anyone has questions.
Awesome. Thank you guys. That was so great. Really wonderful. Yeah, so I'll sort of field questions. If you have a question, you could go to the reactions and then you could raise your hand. And I see Christy Wells has raised your hand. Christy, do you want to just unmute yourself and ask your question?